I think a lot of the tradition began, a big part of it began with the 1910 fires, when prior to that time we did not have, we didn't have a lot of backcountry presence. We set up a pretty extensive trail system, bridge building system, and then lookouts. And with the building back in there, putting in backcountry stations, building trail, and maintaining trail and phone lines, we ended up beginning to create and then maintain a whole backcountry system, which was done with hand tools at the time. I remember when I first got here, a lot of the agencies, especially a lot of the old timers, were real proficient in the use of hand tools. And as those people left, oftentimes their expertise wasn't passed down, and that's something that we're trying really hard to try and maintain and find enough, information and enough skill to pass this down to other people in the agency.
Well, the old timers are disappearing, but when a new person, a new recruit on a trail crew, realizes that there are old timers and realizes that there has been a long tradition and a lot of pride, sometimes there'll be a spark where they'll want to continue in that. But I think it's important that the new people understand that these are tools that have been used, that have been held in craftsmen's hands for years and years. And then they can begin to feel that too.
This program will show you all kinds of hand tools used in trail work, especially crosscut saws and axes. We'll also show you how to replace a handle and sharpen an axe.
Pride is learned, and you learn it from other people's examples mostly. Pride also comes from having good tools.
Sometimes it's like you're just out here making a paycheck, and your work might reflect that. We just want to get it done and over with. Whereas other people who decide that they want to take a lot of pride in it. And to me, part of pride means you're going to actually have more fun at work, because it gets to be like, let's do this the best we can, and it shows in your trail work, but it also shows in your attitude at work, and it makes the job a lot more enjoyable. But one of the biggest things that I see, in addition to being able to use tools safely and economically, is that when we're out there, a lot of times when we're dealing with local people, and they may or may not have a good impression of the agency. If they go along and they see a piece of trail work or a log that's cut out really well, and they say, man, that's a nicely chopped log, or that's a really nice piece of crib that somebody built, then all of a sudden, whatever group we're working for, we gain some credibility. So when we end up talking to them, we end up getting a lot further with the messages that we have to pass, because they say, well, maybe these people know what they're doing. And I think that's a real important part of what we can gain through this.
This is a bow saw. Bow saws are a good lightweight saw for light clearing, maybe trees and logs up to 8 or 10 inches. Yeah, you don't need to apply a lot of pressure. The weight of it and the sharpness of the blade lets it cut right through. You can throw away the blade as soon as it's dull, but a good trick to know is that it's not always a dull blade that's your problem. Sometimes the teeth get out of set, and if you take a pair of needle nose pliers or a crescent wrench and grip each tooth and bend it slightly in the direction that it was bent at the factory, it'll usually cut again for you. This is a folding pruning saw. They're really good for cutting limbs where you don't have a lot of space. This is another type of pruning saw. The blade on this saw can be sharpened with a regular chainsaw file, so anyone can sharpen it. That's a real advantage. Crosscut saws have been made in all different shapes and sizes and with different tooth patterns for different purposes. This two-man saw is a bucking saw. It has a straight back. It's fairly stiff, so one person can use it. It has lance teeth with 4 cutters and 2 rakers, so it will work well in softwood like pine. This is a felling saw. It also has lance teeth. It's a felling saw because it has a suede back and a thinner belly, and it's a lot more flexible. This dandy saw has plain teeth. They're all little triangles. It might work pretty well in hardwood. And this one-man saw has perforated lance teeth. They'd work well in a softwood. Right now, trail crews usually use whatever saw they can get their hands on that's good and sharp and in shape. And since a felling saw or falling saw is lighter to carry, that might be more practical even if you are bucking logs. Warren Miller has written the classic book on crosscut saw care and maintenance. And I think anyone who's going to use a crosscut saw should at least read that and have some exposure to the care and filing of crosscut saws.
Most of the saws that we use are vintage saws such as Atkins or Diston or Simons, and they're not made anymore.
Now, if you want a good saw, you've got to get an old saw. When you find an old saw, you can check the thickness, and you can actually feel the thickness of the metal with your fingertips, believe it or not. And a good saw is concentric taper ground where the center of the back is the thinnest metal, quite a bit thinner than the teeth. And that way, without even setting the teeth, it cuts a wider kerf than the width of the body of the saw. You can't tune and file a saw in the field. Filing or tuning without a good vise is almost sure to ruin the saw, so it's best not to try to do that in the field. If your saw is sharp, it pulls out long curls of wood, maybe 6 or 8 inch long curls of wood in green wood. If your saw's bringing out sawdust, it's dull. It's terribly dull. Your saw will stay sharp all season, maybe 2 seasons if you're not using it too much. If you keep it out of the dirt, never saw through dirt, don't let it rust, keep it sheathed, and don't drop it or knock it over. I really try to impress on my crews that they'd better not hurt that saw.
But we keep them covered with a light oil anytime they're in moisture, and anytime we bring it back into the station, we oil it so that it doesn't get, ambient moisture from the air. There's a whole bunch of gourds. Sometimes I transport most saws between 2 slabs of plywood that are greased on the inside. I've seen 2 really bad wrecks with outfitter stock that's come from the saw coming untied on one side of the animal, and then in brush or whatever coming unsheathed, and the animal spun around and cut up a bunch of other animals around him. When we're transporting one or a bunch of saws long distances, we'll have them sheathed and we'll have them wrapped in a mani and bent over the animal, and it'll be tied to the forks of the saddle and then tied down either to the latigo or the double cinch on each side with the teeth facing backwards. And then for shorter saws, oftentimes one-person saws, which are often packed on stock, will be in a wooden sheath where the handle's out and the sheath will strap to the pack animal.
I use fire hose. It's cheap and replaceable and readily available everywhere. And I use strings of parachute cord or Velcro to tie it onto the saw. The most injuries I've seen with crosscut saws are people putting on the sheaths and taking off the sheaths and handling them too quickly. Where I work, the sun's really intense and the saw blade can get very hot. And if you've taken your gloves off to tie the knots in the string or to remove the Velcro and then pick up the saw, it almost burns your hands, and I've seen people drop the saw suddenly. If you're not going terribly far or with a shorter saw, you can put it on your shoulder with the teeth facing away from your neck, take off the rear handle, hold on to the front handle, and carry it that way. You wouldn't want to leave them strung for long or they might hold the bend. There hasn't been a lot of official training for crosscut sawing. The danger in a lot of falling and bucking operation comes from the trees, not from the saw. So I'd recommend that anyone who's going to do a lot of bucking go out with someone who can teach them about bucking, whether they're using a crosscut saw or a chainsaw. And I'm assuming that we'll have more regular type training programs available soon.
What's coming into play now is that crosscut saw training is being attached to the chainsaw training as part of that, you know, if people are going to be used crosscut so that it can be used more responsibly.
We'll need to make one cut down here off the trail far enough to give the pack animals clearance when they come by. The other cut I'd like to make up here where it's suspended off the ground. No matter where we cut, the tree is under a lot of compression and it's going to tend to pinch the saw. And we won't have any trouble moving a bigger log as opposed to a smaller log because it's on such a steep hill it's going to want to move. We'll want to make both our cuts at compound angles, opening up this way so the log will roll downhill. It's a real shame to make your cuts at the wrong angle and wedge your log in place and have to start all over again with a crosscut. And I just as soon make the upper cut first, and that'll relieve the compression for the second cut. There's no use fighting compression on both cuts if you don't have to. As far as safety, for both cuts we're going to want to finish from the uphill side with one person bucking. We're going to want to be aware that there's a chance the upper part could come down the hill too if the root wad gives way. You swamp out the area where you're going to stand to cut. You decide where your body position is going to be so that you can pull that crosscut saw alongside your body, not towards yourself. You want to have good footing and have all the vegetation out of the way of the saw so it'll run smoothly.
We'll take and scrape out some footholds with Pulaski. We may have to move some rocks out of the way. We may have to move a lot of other logs and down debris out of the way.
Then if the tree has thick or dirty bark or charred bark, you are doing best to chop that away with an axe so you won't dull the saw. Then you unsheath the saw and put the sheath where you can find it and hand one end of it across the log to your partner. Get in your positions, start pulling gently. Sometimes one person needs to reach out and kind of guide the center of the back of the saw until the cut gets started.
Oftentimes you can saw through wood for a long time and never need anything on that. Or you could get into a ponderosa pine or a fir that's real pitchy, and you're going to need to get rid of that pitch with a solvent because it'll bind it right up.
Hey, that helps.
If you have some type of solvent, and what we're recommending now is a citrus-based solvent to remove that pitch, but get rid of the pitch immediately.
After you've started a cut, if there's going to be any chance of compression, you want to put in a wedge, or maybe two if it's a big log. You put in wedges at 10 and 2 o'clock. Drive them in. You don't want any chance of pinching that saw because it's very hard to get it back out. Then when two people start sawing together, especially when it's the first time they've worked as partners, they need to figure out how to work as partners. And the saw will teach them and they'll teach each other. Sometimes there's a lot of yelling involved, but that's kind of how it works.
When you're working with a new partner and you're not used to sawing together, you may end up watching your partner saw and watching how his saw is. If there's any bend in it, that saw is going to be binding and fighting as it goes through the wood. And you end up facing the main part of the saw with your body and pulling that saw right straight across your body underneath. And again, as you're pulling, you're not pulling straight, but you're following the arc that's created by the saw. As you get better and better at running it, you'll hear it change. And it'll change from sounding like it's working going through the wood to a point where it's singing. And when that happens, there's almost no effort in sawing. You can pull with one finger and each person can just pull it back and forth.
And they can tell when they're doing it right because the saw will sound better, the chips will fly, nobody will be pulled off balance. But it's something you learn as you work with a partner.
When you use wedges, a lot of times is keeping that open, and oftentimes the log may roll, and as it rolls, it's going to pinch. So then a lot of times what we'll do is we'll wedge it, and we'll drive an axe or a Pulaski head spanning the kerf of the cut to hold that log and keep it from rolling. And there's ways that you can control some pretty large logs, sometimes up to a couple tons, with just one Pulaski driven in there, and it's a real safe way to do it.
Then as you cut through and get close to where the log may shift or may fall through, usually you take the handle off of the downhill side, or whichever side has become hardest to saw from, and let one person finish the cut.
Yeah.
And that one person finishing the cut should use just the teeth on the end of the saw. And if the saw does drop down into the dirt, you're going to dull the end teeth, which don't matter quite as much as the middle teeth.
Okay.
So when the tree is wide in comparison to the length of the saw, or when the tree is large diameter, we can't clear our chips with two people because we can't pull far enough to get the chips out, so the saw will start to bind up. When that happens, we usually go to single bucking, and then we can take a longer stroke and we can clear our chips, which actually makes single bucking in this case less effort than double bucking with a short saw.
If the log is going to drop into a trench in the trail from which you will then have to roll it up out of, it's pretty smart to put logs that'll act as ramps down there that it can roll along. Anytime you can use a mechanical advantage and move that tree out of the way, the easier you can do it, the better it's going to be. And if you can even get by without even cutting the log, that's better yet, if there's some way to move that efficiently out of there. If there's a possibility of that saw falling through into the dirt, we'll take a piece of bark off the tree with the axe or with the Pulaski and lay it under, a clean piece, and lay it underneath there just as to double up our chance of not doing anything to the sharpness of that saw. You may want to cut poles to use as levers, or use your pry bars and have them underneath the log so that when it drops free you can lift up on the levers and push it out of there. Pretty much you need your creativity, and you need a good sense of mechanical advantage, and you need to figure all this out before you've cut the log.
These are loppers, all different types. They're really good for brushing, cutting brush along trails. There are two basic types of lopper. This is the anvil type, where the blade cuts square against an immovable anvil. And this is the hook and blade type, or bypass lopper, where the blade slides by a hook. You use them both the same. For either type, you hold the handles down at the end and grip what you're going to cut and squeeze straight. You never want to twist. The hook and blade shear is handy on limbs because you can sort of hook it over what you're going to cut. It's sort of self-seating. When you need to sharpen them, the anvil type is different than the hook and blade type. On the anvil one, you sharpen each side of the blade, and you want to keep it straight so it still meets the anvil squarely. The hook and blade, or bypass type, is like a pair of scissors. You only want to sharpen the outside of the blade. If you sharpen the inside, you'll absolutely ruin the tool. I've got 3 more cutting tools. This one is a bush hook or a brush hook, depending on what part of the country you come from. It's got a good leather sheath. This is another bush hook or brush hook. These are sharp on both sides of the blade. They're good for cutting small diameter vegetation. They've got a heavy head and a long handle, so you can get a lot of momentum. They can also be very dangerous if you're not watching out for your other crew members and your own feet. Well, rather than chopping like you would with an axe, you want to sort of pull it towards you and slice as you swing. And this is a Sandvik. It's got a replaceable blade. It's very lightweight. And it'll cut through things that an axe won't cut through in one swipe because of the narrow blade, almost machete-like.
Pulaski's probably the main implement used for firefighting. It's also used quite a bit in trail. It's got a chopping or cutting edge, which is filed on both sides and filed pretty sharp for chopping, and then a mattock or hoe end to it, which is filed on the inside of the curve, and that's used for moving dirt or small rocks, stuff like that. When you're pulling dirt and you're pulling it towards you, a lot of times when people, and myself included, started doing it, you pull almost in a straight line. And that's nowhere near as effective as if it's angled slightly. And when you're angled, you're actually cutting, almost like a plow moving through the dirt. You're cutting dirt as you're moving, and then it's a lot easier to remove it from the tread. A lot of times people that are working with the Pulaski all the time, again, are using their legs as the main source of power for it. If you're carrying a tool like a Pulaski over distance, it should be sheathed. The sharpest cutting implement on the Pulaski should be still facing away from you on the downhill side, so that if you fall, you can get rid of it. It's usually a good idea to have at least 10 feet between people. So a lot of times with the hoe end, we'll sharpen it at the end or the beginning of each trail hitch, and that'll often be sharpened with a grinder because you can take that down. The cutting end of the Pulaski is different because you don't want to change the temper and make it too hard or too soft. So a lot of times we'll file that with a file rather than using a grinder. A combination or a combi tool it's a small shovel that can be rotated and turned downwards for a hoe, and on the far end of it is a pick. So when it's turned into the hoe position, you've got a hoe on one side and a pick on the other side, and that hoe is also really good for cutting roots. It's also a very small, fairly narrow base shovel, which can be pretty good for cleaning water bars and areas where you're doing a lot of work on drainage. A cloud is almost shaped like a much wider hoe with teeth or a long rake end on the other side, and it's heavy enough for cutting light roots and for moving a fair amount of light or decomposed granitic soil types where there's not much compaction or adhesion within the dirt itself. Council tool is almost like a section off a sickle bar mower, which usually has 4 or 5 teeth on it, and it's triangular, it's sharp, and it's used for lighter litter and duff for removing that.
You use a straight pick or a miner's pick for prying rocks out of the ground or fracturing rock that has veins or weak points in it. When you're using a pick, it's really important that you be wearing long pants and sleeves, of course, and a hard hat and safety glasses. With any of the heavy swinging tools, you want to have your feet shoulder width apart and swing it up behind you, clear over your head. Then straighten your arms, let your hands slide down to the ends of the handle like you would with a baseball bat, and then bend at the knees and let the lowering of your body accelerate the tool so it hits the ground really hard. You kind of keep your back straight as you do this, and it's not hard on your back if you're doing it right. You really use your legs a lot and bend your knees. Pick mattock has a pointed pick tip on one end and an adze hoe type blade on the other end. They're really good for grubbing new tread into heavy rocky soil. They've got more weight to them than an adze hoe or a Pulaski, and you can swing hard and pull a lot of material with them. and also pry heavy rocks with the pick end. The cutter-matic is like the pick-matic, only instead of a pick point opposite the matic side, you've got a sort of short, dull axe. And that's heavy duty, and you can cut roots with it real well.